Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event today, How to Design Impactful Carbon Programs. I know people are trickling into the room, but in the interest of time, I'll just get right into it. My name is Jonathan, and I'm on the marketing team here at Regrow. And today I'm joined by two experts in the nitty-gritty details behind running ag carbon programs, Lucia and Reusner and Katelyn Winkler. And trust me, there are a lot of these nitty-gritty details. If you're at an organization that's looking to take action in your ag value chain, that wants to plan and run a program that makes a meaningful, measurable impact on farm, then you're really in the right place, and we're excited to have you here. A couple quick housekeeping notes on the event before we get started, and then I'll pass it over to Lucia and Katelyn to introduce themselves. First of all, please ask any questions that you have through the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the call to answer those. We'll also follow up directly for any questions that we didn't get to. So just please use this as an opportunity to get the answers that you need from our speakers. We'll also be running a few polls and asking some discussion questions during the course of the event, and you can use the chat function to chime in with your responses. Speaking of that chat function, if you're comfortable dropping where you're zooming in from in the chat, I'd love to see how many different places are represented. Personally, I'm talking to you from sunny and not quite so humid yet, Raleigh, North Carolina. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded. We'll share that recording via email as soon as it's available. So if you have to jump early, no worries. Awesome. So with that out of the way, let me first pass it to Lucia, and she can introduce herself.
Great, thank you. So I'm Lucia von Reusner. I'm the carbon technical lead at Regrow Ag, which means I support all of our clients with designing high impact, accurate, and verifiable carbon programs, and also bringing them through certification and verification. And I'm calling in from sunny and never humid Boulder, Colorado.
And I'm Katelyn Winkler, a Policy and Protocols Associate here at Regrow. I'm calling in from the sunny but chilly Iowa City, Iowa today, and I help support Lucia on all of the above that she mentioned.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thank you both. You'll hear much more from them over the course of the next hour or so. But before we just dive in, let's set some goals for today's talk. So what do we want everyone to get out of this session? And knowing how busy everyone is, how can we tell whether this was actually a productive use of an hour or not? First of all, you should leave with an understanding of how organizations can demonstrate their impact on farm. You should also understand the common pitfalls of ag carbon program design and how to avoid them, which is basically the keys to success in program design. And most of all, we hope that you're leaving here feeling empowered and also inspired to start taking climate action in your supply chain. Let's move together from an understanding of what's happening today in your supply chain to actually moving the needle and launching programs that meaningfully reduce emissions. And just really briefly on Regrow, that's what we're all about here. Our mission is to make agriculture resilient globally. So here are some facts and figures about who we are and how we've grown over the past 7+ years. Got billions of acres covered, a host of PhDs in relevant areas like soil science and remote sensing, and more than 100 customers that we support up and down the value chain. And we're especially proud of that $19 million number. That's payments that have been made to growers via Regrow supported programs. So all this experience and expertise gives us unique insight into the carbon program design process that we're going to walk through today. And this is really what Lucia and Katelyn live and breathe in their daily work. That's why we're all here. The volatility of agricultural supply, pressures from consumers, and the barrage of all new regulation from governments means now is really the time to act on farm. How can we feed a growing population and continue operating or even start to operate within sustainable planetary boundaries? And that's obviously a challenging situation that our industry finds itself in, but within every challenge is an opportunity for reinvention, and we really feel like we're at that moment for agriculture. So with that important context in mind, let's get down to it. We're going to start off with a poll before I pass it over to Lucia. And I'm going to ask everyone how familiar you are with ag carbon program design. And let me just launch that poll now. One sec. So you should all be seeing that pop up. So please take a second to answer that. We've got the results pouring in. Good mix here. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Great. So I'm going to give you a couple more seconds, and I'll go ahead and end the poll. Great. And so this will also help Lucia kind of just meet everybody where they are with regards to the presentation. So we had 19% of people say they're extremely familiar, 17% give a 4, 43% at 3. So it looks like most people fall in that like some familiarity, but looking to learn more, which is great. And then 7% at 1 and 14% at 2. So good mix of experience, which should make for an awesome hour or so. Again, I've heard from someone that the chat might be disabled, so let me check on that. But if you have any other comments or questions for now, just use the Q&A box and I'll be able to see them from there. So with all that being said, let me go ahead and close this poll and we can move on to Lucia's part of the presentation.
Great, thank you. So the way that we advise our customers to think about their regenerative ag journey is in a 3-step process. So first, we learn what your agricultural emissions footprint is and help establish the baseline against which to measure progress. This includes understanding where are regenerative ag practices already being adopted and where is there a big gap in adoption. From there, we can then prioritize the ingredients, commodities, and geographies to target interventions and investments for the greatest impact. We then work with our customers to launch farmer-facing programs and set up monitoring systems to track progress and quantify outcomes. So the goal really is to set up this cycle of continuous improvement that enables effective learning, and also scaling of the interventions that have the greatest impact on carbon and broader biodiversity services and agricultural resilience. So we have another poll and wanting to get a sense from the audience of where is your organization today in this continuous improvement loop?
Awesome. So just launched the poll, so everybody go ahead and chime in. Okay, so we got 25, 26, 27 answers. Also, I'm going to go ahead and end it and share the results. And Lucia, are you able to see those?
Yeah, I can. So it looks like
Awesome.
about 20% of you haven't started baselining yet. 7% are establishing baselines, 11% prioritizing and planning action, 45% executing and monitoring programs, and 19% rebaselining and reporting program outcomes. So a good spread here.
Awesome.
So what do we mean when we say carbon programs? When we talk about carbon programs, we mean supporting clients with transitioning practices on the field or across the supply shed to improve carbon outcomes, as well as the related soil health, water, and biodiversity impacts, and also to report on the results of those programs. Next slide. In order to design your program for the highest impact, you will want to keep the following things in mind. First, which crops, regions, and practice change combinations have the highest abatement potential? What kind of influence do you have over the field? What kind of traceability, touch points with farmers? What is the end use case of your carbon program? Are you looking to generate Scope 3 insets, Scope 1 offsets, make SBTI claims, do inventory reporting? And also, what kind of partnerships do you need to establish, and which ones do you already have? So how do you go about credibly demonstrating the impact of your program? The key steps in implementing an impactful carbon program are first, enrolling eligible farmers. Next is accurate quantification. And the last is verification. And we're going to dive into these 3 areas in the rest of our presentation. It's also important to know that carbon protocols have 7 core requirements for what needs to be addressed in designing your program. So the first is establishing the relevant project boundary for quantifying the sources, sinks, and reservoirs that are going to be associated with the project. Next is additionality and causality. So providing evidence that the project in fact caused the change in greenhouse gas emissions. Next is defining the credit type. So is your program going to be a reductions, a removals, or avoidance project? Next is establishing a credible baseline. So the counterfactual scenario against which your intervention and program is compared. And then next is permanence. So ensuring the longevity of carbon pools and stocks. And this is particularly important if you are reporting removals and sequestration. Next is having a clear monitoring plan. So using accurate and precise measurements to quantify greenhouse gas data. And then finally is unique issuance. So avoiding double counting of any reductions, removals that you are claiming from your program. So it's also important to be aware of the different accounting methods and their use. So for those of you that do not have experience setting up carbon programs yet, you're probably most familiar with inventory accounting, which is used for evaluating the annual emissions and removals within the whole corporate inventory. If you do have experience with carbon programs, then you might be familiar with intervention accounting, which is used to account for the specific changes caused by interventions in a project. Intervention accounting for scope 3, for example, generally requires support from an LCA allocation process to convert the reduction and removal units for use in a corporate inventory reporting. And intervention project methods are what generate credits for insets or offsetting.
Awesome. And Lucia, I just want to ask one question that we got already that came through, because I think it's important to have the context from the previous slides, but we got a question from Andres, which was, can it be the 3 reductions, removals, and avoidance?
Yes, it depends on the scope of your project and also where you are submitting, if you're going to an offset protocol or for scope 3 insetting. So it depends really on the methodology that you're going to go through, especially if you're doing an offset protocol. But yes, your project can include a variety of these.
Awesome, thanks.
So there are many governance bodies that have been established to oversee the integrity of carbon programs. So some of the key ones to be familiar with are the offset carbon registries. So you have CAR, which is US-based, Vera, which is global, and Gold Standard, which is global. And these audit projects and issue credits. You then have SustainCert, which is a scope 3 project verifier. It also audits projects and issues credits, but they do not develop methodologies. Then you have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which develops general carbon market best practice guidance that is used to inform the protocols and corporate commitments. They do not audit or issue credits. And then you have SBTI, which evaluates corporate climate goals, but they do not audit or issue credits. And then you also have third-party assurance providers, which evaluate corporate inventories and kind of give them a stamp of assurance, but they also do not issue credits. So designing a successful carbon program that demonstrates impact is complex. So we are now going to give an overview of the common pitfalls that we've encountered in designing impactful carbon programs and how to avoid them to ensure success. So the first step is really ensuring that the program is enrolling eligible fields and farmers. This involves defining the program logic for enrolling fields. So you really want to make sure you understand the protocol eligibility rules, particularly if you're going through a scope 1 offset program. And you want to make sure to include additionality and causality requirements. Again, making sure that there is in fact a practice change that will be happening caused by your project. And then you also want to establish enrollment checks. So establish a method for screening fields during enrollment to make sure that you are enrolling the fields that are eligible for the program. And then you also want to make sure to align support and incentives. So changing farmer and field behaviors on the ground takes time and can be hard. So you want to provide the agronomic support for practice change and also align incentives. It's good to maybe treat the first 1 to 3 years of a program as really an R&D stage. And it might make sense to align your incentives around practice adoption until farmers really get used to the practice, and then shift to incentivizing and paying for outcomes. And so now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Katelyn.
Thank you. So another key component of any successful program is, of course, accurate quantification. And a few components of quantification that we want to go over include the first being using the highest tier of quantification. So we know from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sectors Removals Guidance that it's recommended to use the highest tier of quantification possible. And the carbon protocols give several options for this, with tier 1 and 2 being global or country level emissions factors approaches, while tier 3 approaches include modeled and measured data. And as you go up the tiers, spatial granularity increases while uncertainty is decreased. And like I said, protocols allow several of the different methods, so it's important to decide which method best meets the goals of your program and reporting needs. In terms of the baseline, it's incredibly important to establish a credible counterfactual baseline that is unique to project or intervention-based accounting. And from our partners, we found that baseline methodology can have a pretty significant impact on project outcomes. So it's incredibly important to identify which method accurately quantifies and reflects on-field practices. For example, a threaded blended baseline methodology can reflect complex crop rotations in the history, while a matched baseline is more suitable for a like-for-like comparison, like nutrient management, where the interventions will be crop-specific. Additionally, there is an inherent uncertainty associated with measuring soil organic carbon year to year. So it's incredibly important and, in fact, required to quantify the associated uncertainty with your program. So when selecting a quantification partner, make sure you understand, number 1, if they quantify uncertainty, and number 2, how and by which methods. Finally, soil sampling can be an often overlooked component of carbon protocols or a carbon program. Even if you use a modeling-based approach, soil sampling is typically required by the protocols. So make sure you account for this in your program planning and design phase, noting particularly when soil sampling needs to occur so that you don't miss out on that window of opportunity. And now we're going to have a poll to discuss what methodological tier of data are you using today and why. I'll pass it over to Jonathan.
Yep, so I just launched the poll. If y'all can vote in there, that'd be awesome. And then I realized that the chat function is disabled. So if you want to provide any more context around why you're using a certain tier of data, please feel free to drop that into the Q&A. And we'll also cover that when we get to the end. We can share some of that feedback so that other folks within the group know, who else is using what tier of data and why. So go ahead and vote, and then again, drop anything else into the Q&A. Awesome. Let's see some rolling in. Give you a few more seconds to answer the poll. And then share the results. Awesome. So can you see those, Katelyn?
Yes. Looks like about 20% are using a tier 1 method, 50% are using a tier 2 method, and 44% are using a tier 3 method. So seems like tier 2 and 3 are a bit more popular, which makes sense, as we're seeing definitely a shift in the industry towards increasing granularity and decreasing uncertainty associated with those methods. Another equally important component of a successful program is verification. As you can see from this diagram, there's typically 3 distinct steps in a third-party verification of a carbon program. Like Lucia was discussing, that first component involves designing your program. You're going to want to be thinking about program eligibility logic and ensuring that you're following all of the rules of your chosen protocol. Then the second phase is the MRV phase. You can think of this as, the boots on the ground, grower support, the interventions are taking place. And then at the end, you're going to, of course, quantify the outcomes of the program. And ideally, you will be issued credits once you've submitted them to your third-party verifier. And once you have those credits, you can then transact them on the carbon market. And so in between these phases, this is where we see that documentation that you may be familiar with in terms of the ex ante documentation to the third-party verifier. This can look like a PDD or a project design document or an IDD, intervention design document, from both Vera and SustainCert respectively. And then once you actually have done the quantification and the interventions have taken place, you'll usually submit what's called a monitoring report that details how it went, what the outcomes are, and how you plan to monitor the project. There's a few things you want to keep in mind when it comes to the verification process. The first of which is understanding what data is actually needed for verification. And we encourage you to take a look at your chosen carbon protocol, the associated standard with that protocol, as well as the greenhouse gas protocol, land sectors removals guidance, to understand what kind of data you need to be tracking. And ideally, you'll be looking at these requirements pre-program so that you know exactly what data you're going to be collecting throughout the lifespan of the program. Accordingly, it's important to understand what monitoring methods are allowed. So, for instance, is remote sensing allowed for a particular type of data? Is it an MRV type monitoring method that's going to be best used for this kind of data? Understanding those methods before you go through the program will ensure a successful verification. And finally, it is required for most carbon protocols, if not all, to ensure a permanence monitoring plan to track reversals. Of course, we're all here. We want to make sure that the carbon is being sequestered in the soil for as long as possible, but the reality is that reversal events do happen. So it's important to have a plan in place before you start the program so that you have a protocol for if a reversal does occur, how you're going to handle that, and how that will affect the outcomes of your program. So, in sum, today, we talked about several core components of impactful programs, the first of which being the enrolling eligible farmers component. Secondly, ensuring that you have accurate quantification and some key aspects there to consider when selecting, a quantification partner or methods you'll be using, as well as core components of verification that will help ensure a successful verification of credits. And I will pass it over to Jonathan for the Q&A portion.
Awesome. Well, thanks. That was great. Appreciate you both filling us in there and providing a really good foundation. But we have a good amount of time for Q&A here. We've had quite a few come in already. Please continue to drop those into the Q&A box and use this time with Lucia and Katelyn to your advantage because they're very busy folks. So let me start off with our first question, which was, what methodology is used under SustainCert?
Sure. So SustainCert does not dictate the specific methodologies and protocols that need to be submitted. It is on the project developer to choose a methodology and make the case as to why that methodology is the most relevant and credible for their program design. We generally tend to draw from the established offset protocols to establish the methodology for various Scope 3 programs that then get audited by SustainCert.
Awesome. Thanks. Next question we have is related to land use change. So could you address land use change in eligibility of farms? What is the common framework? For example, how many years not being deforested?
Sure. So in the, or Katelyn, do you want to take this
Sure.
one?
That's a great question, and I'm so glad that you asked this question. I think it's often overlooked in terms of program eligibility, and then you get to, the interventions actually taking place, and then it's like, oh my goodness, I completely forgot about this component. So I think generally, in terms of deforestation, that falls under the conversion of native ecosystems rule. And so I know for VM42 and CARCEP, that, that can't have happened in the past decade prior to the program. In terms of during the program years, I believe that if deforestation does occur, that might invalidate that particular field's eligibility. But I would encourage anyone to look very closely at those requirements because they are so important for a program.
Awesome. Lucia, anything to add there, or all good?
Nope.
All right, awesome. Got a couple of questions that are pretty related here. So I'm going to start with this first one, which is which offset protocols are relevant for scope 3? I thought they were just for scope 1. So an important clarifying question there.
So we generally draw from VM42 and CARCEP, as Katelyn mentioned. And there's a similar question here around kind of what's the difference between insetting and offsetting, and is that just in the selection of the participating growers? So that is definitely one difference in that for scope 3 programs, you have to be selecting farmers that are within your supply chain. And then you also have to make sure that whereas in the offset programs, offsets are generated from the program writ large and are sold independent of the crops. For scope 3, those insets are really tied to the crop and need to be, sold throughout the supply chain based on the sourcing of that crop. So there's a lot of commonalities that can be drawn from VM42 and CARCEP that are directly applicable to running very similar interventions on very similar types of lands or very similar types of farmers, just a different use case.
Great. There's another question here related to VM42, if we want to tackle that one next. So it's, as we're supporting VM42 project developers, how do we explain from the moment there's only one registered program? What are the main blockers that we see?
Yes, this is definitely something that we think about at Regrow, the fact that there hasn't been any VM42 project besides one that has gotten registered credits. And I think that a few months back, there were a few programs that were flagged for some concerns for the VM42. And so I think taking a look at the concerns highlighted by Vera is a great place to start in terms of seeing why other programs haven't been moving forward and what the blockers are there. I think also it's incredibly important to remember that VM42 is a pretty new protocol. I think it's only existed for a few years. And as we know very well at Regrow, these programs take an extraordinary effort to get off the ground. There is so much to think about and plan for. So I think there's a lot of programs that are just now moving into that submission phase. And so I'm hopeful that there will be more VM42 credits issued very soon.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the biggest blockers for why projects haven't been getting approved is poor quality documentation in the submission process. And a lot of the aspects that we touched on prior are things that are really important to include in your project documentation, and you have to be extremely thorough and extremely detailed, and you really have to make sure that you understand the rules of the program in setting up the design as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we have two pretty related questions that I can go to next that are really about like making sure that things get validated and that they match a lot of the requirements in program design. So one was about permanence and one is about reversals. Let's start with the permanence question. So can you talk about the permanence of carbon sequestration? How long is permanent and how can permanence be assured?
Do you want to take that one, Katelyn?
Sure, that's a great question. And it's dependent upon the protocol. So if I'm remembering my figures right, I believe that CARCEP says 100 years. Vera just changed theirs, and I believe it's now 40 or 60 years, I believe. So in terms of permanence, it's certainly a very long time. And I think that for a lot of companies that are wanting to start these programs, you think about the next 60 years and having to ensure that the carbon really has been sequestered in the soil. That's a very long time. And particularly for the agricultural space, farming and the decisions made on farm change so much year by year. And so it can be really daunting to think about how to retain growers for that amount of time. And so I think that staying abreast of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol land sectors removals guidance and what they have to say about permanence will be really key here, and ensuring that any of the guidance put out by, either LSRG or the individual protocols around permanence and what methods of permanence monitoring are allowed will help to inform how you can assure that permanence and that requirement is met within your project.
Mm-hmm. And it's also important to note that permanence is usually, and reversals are generally assessed on a program level, not necessarily just in the individual field. So oftentimes a program can balance out reversals via sequestration happening in other parts of the program. But if a significant reversal events happen, that's why projects generally have to keep a buffer pool, or protocols have a buffer pool, so that there's essentially an insurance pool to protect against reversals that gets released in those instances.
Awesome. And you teed me up for the next question, which was around reversals. So this is really around the how of quantification for reversals. So are we able to quantify reversals accurately, and how is that actually done? If you can speak to that.
Yeah, so another technicality of carbon programs is if you lose the ability to monitor a field, it is automatically considered a full reversal. So it's really important to have in place a long-term monitoring plan. And fortunately, remote sensing can be used to enable long-term monitoring as well. And then on the actual definition and quantification of reversals, so within agricultural soil carbon projects, it's generally defined as large-scale sustained tillage events. And it really depends on your method of quantification, the ability to do that. But in with Regrow, we use tier 3 modeling based on practice detection, and we quantify the changes in tillage over time, and can use that to track reversals.
Awesome, thanks. Want to transition a little bit to two questions that we had around the farmer side of things. So farmers and growers. So question we got was, what do you see for the future of integrating these programs with existing precision ag and on-farm data collection systems to increase accessibility for growers?
I think that's already happening. That's a great question. I know that for Regrow, we have integrations with various farm management systems. So that step to increase ease of use for growers is already happening. I think there have been several programs and partnerships publicly announced in terms of precision ag companies working with growers and perhaps another, CPG company to help enroll growers in programs. So I definitely think that the future of integration amongst and cooperation amongst all of us in the ag space is bright.
Awesome, thanks. And I think that got to answering the question that we also got around how Regrow obtains farm level data to support practice change on farm, and making sure that farmers are paid for their specific actions. So that was another question. If you have anything else to add, but I think that was a pretty solid answer, Katelyn.
Yeah, I think to just double click on how Regrow specifically works with farmers. So we have two products. We have SI, sustainability insights. That's kind of broad corporate footprinting at a supply shed level. But then we have our MRV product, where farmers are directly enrolled into the platform. They upload their field boundaries and their practice change, and then we use satellite imagery to help verify those practices. And so farmers are contracted with a project developer, which then enrolls them through our tool. And then it's the project developer's responsibility to ensure fair compensation for the carbon that is quantified and verified and sold.
Awesome, thanks. If you want to get any more product specific details, obviously there's a ton more information on our website, and we have other folks who are happy to talk to y'all about SI and MRV and the ag resilience platform that we're building. So wanted to go back to a specific point from earlier, which was the tiers of data methodology. So tier 1, 2, and 3, we had a question, which is, why might a company start with high level data and then work backwards, or I guess work forwards towards more granular data?
Great question. I think the answer is that not every company has that granularity of data. So a company that, is working directly with growers and is able to identify exactly where growers are in their supply chain, they're going to have a lot more access and data that would allow them to use a tier 3 method. But on the other hand, a company that is a bit removed from their growers, might be further down the supply chain. They might not have access to that data. Excuse me. They might not have access to that data. And so they are a bit stuck and have to, use global or country level emissions factors until they have access to that data. And secondly, for some practices or for some interventions, there just might not be the scientific capability to model or measure them yet. And so, you kind of have to rely on those tier 1 or 2 estimates before the quantification methods and the science kind of catches up.
Awesome, thanks. And it was interesting to see how many people in this audience were already using tier 2 and tier 3 data. That was great to see, really heartening. So next one we had was, for those new to carbon project development, would you recommend sourcing or hiring help from a consultant or a supply chain partner? And how would you recommend bringing additional knowledge into projects that might not exist in-house?
Yeah, certainly. Would highly recommend that. I think, just as the comments before around challenges getting projects through VM42, really understanding the requirements for designing a project and for bringing it through verification is a really good investment to make upfront, to make sure that you are setting everything up for success and aren't having to go back and redo things. So I would highly recommend bringing in, part-time consulting help or expert help to guide you in that process.
Awesome. Want to jump back now. I'm getting a lot of questions here, but to specifically soil carbon sequestration. So how reliable are the current SSC estimates using technology entirely and eliminating soil sampling? Is soil sampling still critical?
I think this might be a question in response to the slide in which we were talking about how soil sampling, even if you're employing the use of modeling, is still required. And that's a really good question. So soil sampling, at least in the modeling space, is used to initialize the model. It's very important that you are able to finely tune the model before you begin the project so that you're going to get a certain level of accuracy. And so that's why soil sampling is still required. But as to the other part of your question, I know that, for example, VM42 is exploring the methods, novel methods for SOC quantification that don't involve soil sampling. I know there are several companies out there doing really fascinating and exciting work in soil. I'm going to totally butcher this word, spectroscopy, I believe is the word. And all of these sorts of really, really exciting ways of measuring soil organic carbon without the use of what can often be very expensive soil sampling.
But yes, right now, still required.
Yes.
Awesome.
And I think the question around accuracy maybe was another one. And I think this is where the uncertainty comes in. And so there's recognition that, modeling always has deviations. It's never an exact representation of reality. And so all protocols require that you quantify uncertainty and also take an uncertainty reduction from your removals credits that avoids overcrediting and provides a kind of safeguard around conservativeness of your results.
Great. Got a really good macro question. And it was, what is our greatest challenge overall? And it's 3 options here. And you can add a 4th if there's another one that comes to mind. But better models, better measuring, or better financial rewards incentives?
I think there's room for improvement. I think Katelyn and I can both answer from our different positions, but I think there's room for improvements across the board. I think really making sure that there's proper incentives for farmers to increase enrollment and to maintain longevity of the program is really key. There's still, unfortunately, not very much transparency into how farmers are being compensated, and still a lot of, stories and headlines coming out around unfair compensation. So really making sure that, farmers are the ones doing the work. You want them to continue doing the work. And so they need to have the proper incentives in place. What were the other 2 options?
The options were better models, better measuring, and better financial rewards, which you covered.
I'm going to say if I had to pick between the 3, what do I see as a current, barrier for adoption longevity? I'd go around the finances.
I'd agree with that as well. I think that there are a lot of companies, Regrow included, that are trying to increase accuracy of quantification, kind of on the better model side. There's tons of companies, like we just mentioned, doing work on the better measurement side. But regardless of how you quantify outcomes, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if the growers doing the work, like Lucia said, aren't able to participate, whether that be because of, financial rewards or other barriers to adoption. So I think that prioritizing the farmer and the land and all of this is incredibly important. And, it's very easy for those working on this day to day to get really caught up in the nuances, the nitty gritty. There's so much, there's just so much related to the business side of this and the carbon finance market writ large. And while that's incredibly important, I think at the end of the day, focusing on what truly matters and, helping out our climate will be the best path forward.
Awesome. We have a couple more questions. That would have been a great note to end on, but that was really well said, Katelyn. I think we often call that like pencil farming here. So all the work that happens off farm, and making sure that you still keep the farmer perspective and voices really central to all of that planning is so key. So a couple more. One was, this is a pretty broad question, but just examples of MRV use cases of counting. You can also find some of those on our website, of course. We have plenty of customer stories, but if there's any stories around MRV that either of you two wanted to speak to, wanted to give you the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of or go ahead, Katelyn.
Yeah, do we know, feel free to send in the chat if you are discussing MRV for, project-based accounting or inventory accounting. I know we briefly touched upon both. We can stick to project-based accounting since that's the scope of our current presentation. But we have multiple clients that use our MRV to design carbon programs. They enroll growers. We quantify their outcomes for them. We have experience working with virtually all the major carbon bodies and verifiers. So we are very well versed in terms of the verification process of submitting the paperwork, submitting the actual outcomes, interfacing with the auditors, and ensuring that the credits are that the company will get the credits because they've quantified things accurately. I don't know if that's exactly the example use case that we're looking for. We're happy to add more color to something more specific too.
Yeah, and for the person who asked that question again, please reach out to us if you're curious about more like specific customer stories, and we also have plenty of those available publicly on the website. Sounds good. And then taking it back to the financial incentive question, I think this is a really good one, some good context in front. With half of US farms barely breaking even financially and struggling with farm asset capitalization, how do we create that confidence for producers that the first years of practice transition will produce yields that keep the farm running?
Yeah, great question. And I think that's why up front, we really emphasize the importance of bringing in agronomic support to really make sure that in bringing a farmer along on this journey of changing what they've been doing to something new, that you're really providing the expert support to make sure that they are doing it in a way that makes sense for their farm, for their field, for their soil type, for their crop, and that they're really, that they're trialing with the hands of an expert. And then it can also be really valuable to start the program with payments for practice adoption rather than outcomes, to help provide confidence to the farmer that there's a buffer period for trying new things. And, you want to maintain confidence that they're implementing practices and not get discouraged. If they tried something the first year, it didn't work out, they spent money on it, but then, too bad for you, didn't work out, so you're not going to get any payments. So I would say really focusing on agronomic support and then making sure your incentives are aligned to allow for that R&D period. And then I think also really important is to have this monitoring and verification system in place so that you're really tracking what's happening on the field year to year, and you can create this cycle of continuous improvement. So in addition to tracking the carbon outcomes, also be tracking, yield, and make sure you include time in your program design and your staff time to be really sitting down and reviewing results and seeing, where were there trade-offs? Where did the program not go exactly as planned? And how can you improve into the future?
Yeah. And another actual requirement of soil organic carbon protocols, they have safeguards within the protocols to account for yield declines. There typically can't be more than a 5% yield decline. Otherwise, that intervention is no longer valid for the program. So I think the idea is there, but what Lucia discussed is really important for the actual implementation of that aspect of the protocol.
Awesome. And then there's a question actually pretty directly piggybacking off that practice change issue. So it was mentioned earlier that focusing initial years on just ensuring practice changes is a good place to start, but how does that square with additionality requirements that programs might have?
Yeah, so the program will always need to have additionality and causality, but in those first few years in which the program kicks off, considering how you are compensating the farmers who are enrolled in your project. So you still want to make sure there's additionality and causality, but you might tie your farmer contracts in those first few years with regards to payments a little bit more to practice adoption than necessarily making it all dependent on outcomes.
Gotcha. And then on additionality, we have a question, how does that or does that not apply to annual cropping practices and the transition of land to new operators? So pretty specific one there.
Can you say it again?
Can you talk about additionality and how that does or does not apply to annual cropping practices and the transition of land to new operators?
Yeah. So another thing to note, so additionality is very specific to offset protocols, and it's a slightly higher barrier than a causality, which is in scope 3 programs, but it will apply to any field coming into a program regardless of owner. So there has to be, so in offset protocols, there's a couple different barriers for additionality, one being regulatory requirements. If it's already required by law, it just happens to be a field isn't doing it, then it's still technically required by law, and there's not this need for a carbon program. It wouldn't be considered additional for a carbon program to shift that field. There's also common practice additionality, and that varies a bit depending on the location and the protocol, but essentially, if a significant number of farmers or fields in an area have already adopted a practice, then it would not be considered additional because it's considered common practice in the area. And then there's also financial additionality in terms of demonstrating that this additional finance from carbon markets is needed to shift the practice on the field. So it's not really tied to the ownership of the land. It's really looking at the history of the field and some of the regulatory requirements and practice adoption.
Awesome. Good clarification. We did get a question around the cost of regrow software specifically and whether it was something farmers pay for or the supply chain company. It is not something that farmers have to pay to be involved in these programs. So just wanted to address that one quickly. And then we have one more question around like risk for transition. So it says, if there's more than a 5% loss in yield in the first year of a farmer trying a new practice, what happens then? Isn't that a big risk? The answer is yes. How does that grace period for R&D work in that case? So might be one that's a little tough to answer, but if y'all want to take a stab at that, it'd be great.
Yeah, I do think that that is a risk to a program, and I would candidly say perhaps that's an area where, you know, the protocol needs to do some development in terms of figuring out how that actually works in practice and what, you know, I can't say I'm 100% know what the consequences are in terms of the program and any credits generated from that field. But I think just going back to what Lucia said earlier, that's another reason why it's so important to focus on the agronomic support for these practices and making sure that farmers are appropriately supported and feel like they can actually make these interventions happen without yield being in jeopardy.
Yep. And you can find the exact requirements around yield declines in the protocol, but I believe they are generally assessed on a program-wide level, and then they're assessed, I think, after 5 years. So there is some room for, you know, volatility, but I think we really, looking beyond just what the requirement on the program level is with the registry, it's really thinking about the individual farmers that are enrolled and wanting to provide them the support to ensure those yield declines don't happen and that you're protecting them against volatility. So some of this kind of goes a little bit beyond just what's required in the letter of the protocol and just really thinking about your relationship with the farmers. You're asking them to do a new thing. There, you know, might be trade-offs, unintended consequences. So just really factoring that in and being thoughtful about it, and showing that you're really supporting farmers in that transition journey as well.
Awesome. Well, I think that now is a really great point to end on. Thank you, everybody, so much for all the questions. I know there were a few that we didn't get to, but we were happy to follow up with those after the fact. But really loved seeing how many questions we got. It shows how much like passion and interest there is in this topic and trying to get this protocol or this program design right. So really want to thank everybody who attended. Obviously, if you have further questions, you can reach out to us via our website or on social. Keep an eye out for upcoming events and definitely leave us feedback as you leave the Zoom. We have a short survey to just make sure that we achieve the goals that we set out to do at the beginning of this call. So I always want to be continually improving and be able to give you, the support that you need. So make sure to fill out that survey. Thank you so much to Lucia and Katelyn. I know I learned a ton. There's so many details to these things, and I know that y'all spend every day in them. So it's great to be able to like tap into that experience that y'all have. But otherwise, please reach out. Like I said, fill out that survey and have a great rest of your Thursday. We'll hope to see you again soon.